If you were standing outside Green Hollow Church that morning, you'd remember the way the clouds looked. Low and heavy, as if the sky itself couldn't bear the weight of the day. Every step Julia Moore took across the gravel lot sounded sharper than it should, echoing through the damp air. Her hands gripped a borrowed black umbrella so tight her knuckles whitened, but she didn't notice the cold or the drizzle. She noticed nothing but the white casket at the front of the church and the hollow sound of her own footsteps on the old wooden floor. The church smelled of wilted lilies and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Julia tried to blink away the blur at the edges of her vision, telling herself it was just the early hour, just exhaustion from sleepless nights, just everything except what it really was, the pain. Her son, Ben Moore, was only 7. There should have been birthday parties and scraped knees and laughter still ahead, not this. She moved as if underwater, barely hearing the words of the priest as he welcomed mourners. Her sister Marion squeezed her elbow and whispered, "You okay, Jules?" Julia didn't answer. She was frozen, rooted before the impossibly small casket. Somewhere at the edge of her awareness, someone was crying quietly. It wasn't her. Not yet. She felt like an imposter at her own child's funeral, too numb for the world's expectations of grief. Outside, beyond the stained glass window, a desperate, guttural howl rose up. Several mourners looked over their shoulders. Julia's breath hitched. She recognized that voice. Dakota, the family's German shepherd, was outside with the police. The dog's howling sounded more like a scream than anything canine, scraping raw nerves and memory alike. Dakota's cries didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, more frantic. The mourners shifted in their pews, whispering. Through the glass, Julia could see the dog's form straining at his leash, powerful shoulders bunching as he clawed at the gravel. She could almost feel his desperation vibrate through the air, a wild energy refusing to be caged. 2 officers tried to calm him, but Dakota snapped and whined, uncharacteristically aggressive. Julia's mother shook her head, murmuring about that poor animal's grief. But Julia felt a different fear blooming in her chest. Dakota was Ben's dog, rescued from a field when Julia was too broken to believe in saving anything. Ben had believed, though. "He needs us," Ben had pleaded, clutching the filthy, trembling dog to his chest. "He's not bad, he's just scared." Dakota had become part of their family, loyal and intuitive. Over time, Julia swore the dog knew when Ben was going to have one of his seizures before even she did. But nobody had ever trained Dakota for it. He just knew. And now, with Ben gone, Dakota was howling like he'd lost his own soul. The priest's voice floated in, gentle and measured, talking about the brief but beautiful life Ben had lived, the mystery of God's plan, and the peace that passes understanding. Julia didn't hear the words. She stared at the casket, at the single white rose Marion had placed on top. The way the morning light caught the edge of the wood made it look both fragile and eternal. A sudden sharp bark sliced through the church. Not the usual bark. This was a pattern. Short, then long. Pause. Short, short, long. Julia's eyes snapped wide. She knew that signal. She'd heard it at 2 a.m, in kitchens and hospitals and on car rides. Dakota's seizure alert. Everything in her body went cold. Guilt and dread crashed into her at once. What if... A commotion exploded outside. The doors burst open. Dakota, slick with rain and wild-eyed, had slipped his collar, barreling down the aisle before anyone could react. His fur stood on end, soaked and bristling, claws skidding on the tile, as he launched himself at the casket. Mourners screamed and backed away. Someone shouted for the police. The priest stepped back, shock painted across his face. Dakota pawed at the casket, barking in that same pattern again and again. The noise ricocheted off the stained glass, filling every corner of the church with frantic, living energy. Julia's heart hammered in her chest. Her gut screamed that something was wrong in a way that went deeper than loss, deeper than grief. This wasn't just animal mourning. Dakota was trying to tell her something. A memory flashed through her mind. Ben, small and feverish. Dakota pressed against his side, barking in that pattern until Julia woke and called 911. The doctors had said Dakota saved Ben's life that night. Now, every instinct Julia had, honed by years in the ER, sharpened by motherhood, told her to listen. She tried to move, her legs numb, but Uncle Ray, her late husband's brother, a firefighter from Cincinnati, was already pushing past stunned relatives. He shouted for people to get back, voice full of command and fear. Julia's mouth worked silently. The words didn't come at first. Her own voice was lost under the chorus of shock, police radios, and Dakota's desperate barking. Then she heard herself, whispering at first, then louder. "Open it," she said. Her voice shook. "Open the casket." People gasped. The priest protested, his words lost in the chaos. "This isn't... Miss Moore, please." But Julia was already moving, propelled by something ancient and unstoppable. Ray, big and blunt, wedged himself between the officers and the casket. Dakota stilled, eyes locked on Julia, as if pleading with her to hurry. For one horrible, endless moment, time seemed to freeze, the room filled with the collective tension of 50 people holding their breath. Julia placed her hands on the cool white lid, fingers trembling. "Open it," she cried again, louder this time. Dakota barked, once, sharp, decisive. Ray looked at Julia, saw the certainty in her eyes, and nodded grimly. With a firefighter's sure hands, he disengaged the locks and lifted the lid. The room erupted in noise. Shouts, cries, a flurry of movement as people strained to see. Julia's world narrowed to the inside of the casket, to her son's face, so still, so impossibly pale. And then Ray leaned in, pressed his fingers to Ben's neck, searching. Dakota went silent. Julia's knees buckled. For a split second, nobody breathed. And then Ray's voice rang out, clear and shaking. "He's got a pulse! He's alive!" The church exploded into chaos. Julia's tears finally fell, burning tracks down her cheeks as she dropped to her knees, hope and terror warring in her chest. Dakota pressed his head to the edge of the casket, calm now, watching over Ben with unblinking devotion. Outside, the sky seemed to lighten, just a little, as the impossible morning unfolded, forever changing the meaning of faith, of instinct, and of love that would not be silenced. Chaos erupted in Green Hollow Church the moment Uncle Ray's trembling voice rang out. "He's got a pulse. He's alive." For a few seconds there was a stunned, collective silence, as if no one dared to move or breathe, afraid that any sound would shatter this impossible hope. Then people surged forward, some gasping, others shouting, some simply weeping in disbelief. Julia felt hands grabbing at her arms, voices swirling in her ears. She barely registered any of it. Her entire world had shrunk to the casket, and her son inside it. The priest's face was drained of color, his notes forgotten, while the funeral director stammered about protocol and legal liabilities. The police, startled by the sudden turn, tried to keep the crowd back, but even they were caught between disbelief and awe. Julia pushed past the confusion, kneeling beside the casket, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she searched for any sign of life. Ray's fingers, practiced and steady from years on the fire line, found Ben's wrist. There, a tremor, a flutter, so weak it was almost nothing, but it was enough. Tears streamed down Julia's face as hope and terror tangled inside her. She pressed her palm against Ben's chest, desperate for the rhythm of his heart. She felt it, faint but unmistakable. Dakota, for his part, was silent now. He lay with his chin on the edge of the casket, his wild desperation replaced by vigilant calm. His amber eyes stayed fixed on Ben's face, as if willing the boy to wake up with the sheer force of his love. "Call 911, Julia choked out, her voice raw from the screaming. "He's alive! My son is alive!" A woman in the front row, still clutching her funeral program, fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The operator's voice crackled loud in the silent church as she relayed the impossible news. Code blue, child found alive at his own funeral, need an ambulance now. Ben looked impossibly small in the casket, his face pale and lips tinged with blue. But as Julia brushed his hair back from his forehead, she swore she saw his eyelids flutter. It was hope, fragile and infuriating, a double-edged sword that threatened to cut her down just as she tried to stand. Someone tried to close the lid, muttering about letting the dead rest. Julia whipped around, anger blazing through her fear. "Don't you dare!" she snapped, her voice echoing off the church walls. "He's not dead. He was never dead." Uncle Ray gently pulled her aside as the paramedics rushed in. They worked fast, laying Ben on a stretcher, checking his vital signs, whispering to each other in clipped, urgent tones. One of them, a young woman with dark hair, caught Julia's eye. "He's in a cataleptic state," she said, "but he has a pulse. We're getting him to the hospital now." The crowd parted to let them through. Julia grabbed Ben's limp hand and squeezed, whispering, "Hang on, baby. Please, hang on." Dakota moved at her side, his gaze never leaving Ben. The ride to the hospital was a blur, a whirlwind of sirens, flashing lights, and the rhythmic thump of Julia's heart echoing in her ears. She rode in the ambulance, clutching Ben's hand in one fist, Dakota's leash in the other. The paramedics worked quietly, oxygen mask on Ben. IV started, one of them checking his pulse every few seconds. Julia heard their soft voices. Bradycardic, shallow breathing, get neurology on the line. But the words barely made sense. All she could do was stare at her son's face, willing him to wake up, to prove the world wrong. At the hospital, chaos awaited. Nurses and doctors swarmed, shouting orders, demanding charts, peppering Julia with questions she could barely process. What happened? How long since he was declared? What medications? Any prior episodes? Julia answered as best she could, voice shaky but clear. He had a seizure 3 days ago, was in a coma. Dr. Freeman said there was no brain activity. He signed the certificate himself. A young pediatrician checked Ben's eyes, calling for a portable EEG. The nurse jotted notes furiously. Julia's mind kept circling the same thought. How could this have happened? How could her son have been misdiagnosed as dead? Dakota, not allowed past the double doors, pressed his nose to the glass, whining softly. Julia caught his eye, pressing her palm to the window in silent thanks. He had been right. He had always been right. Uncle Ray, sweat beading on his brow, found Julia in the hall. "You all right?" he asked gruffly. Julia managed a shaky nod. "I don't know," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost him, Ray. I thought—" Her words broke off, replaced by sobs she couldn't stop. Ray wrapped her in a fierce hug. "You didn't lose him, Jules. That dog knew something we all missed." Inside the ICU, monitors beeped, machines hummed, and Ben's body lay unnaturally still. But his chest rose and fell, slow, shallow, but alive. Julia sat beside his bed, refusing to let go of his hand. She watched the green lines flicker on the monitor, clinging to each tiny heartbeat. The hospital's attending neurologist, Dr. Lance Freeman, arrived, his face a mask of professional concern. "Mrs. Moore," he said, "I'm sorry for the confusion, but the previous tests indicated—" Julia cut him off, her anger burning away her fear. "You told me my son was dead. You signed the certificate. But he's not dead. What do you have to say for yourself?" Freeman hesitated, glancing at the chart, the monitors, and then back at Julia. "Catalepsy can mimic death," he said stiffly. "It's a rare neurological state, very hard to detect. His survival may be temporary neural noise." Julia felt rage rise in her chest. "He's not noise. He's my son." The conversation was cut short by the arrival of 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist, their faces grim as they checked Ben's stats. Freeman hovered, refusing to leave. Julia watched his eyes flicker to the chart, then to Ben, then away again, something almost like guilt darkening his expression. As the hours ticked by, Julia's exhaustion grew. She sat in the hard hospital chair, watching Ben breathe, listening to Dakota's muffled whines from the hall. At some point, Uncle Ray left to call the rest of the family. Marion arrived with coffee, pale and shaken, but steady. As dusk fell, Julia's mind replayed the scene in the church again and again. Dakota's frantic barking, the wild scramble, Ray's shaking hands. She remembered Dakota's pattern, his certainty, his refusal to give up. In her gut, Julia knew this was only the beginning. The world had called her son dead. Dakota had called him alive. Now, as darkness crept through the windows and the machines hummed their relentless lullaby, Julia resolved to fight for Ben, for Dakota, for every mother who'd ever been told to give up hope. She squeezed Ben's hand and whispered, "I'm here, baby. I'm not going anywhere." The night deepened, heavy with questions, but Julia's heart burned with a fragile, desperate hope. Hope that would not be silenced. Not now. Not ever. Night pressed heavy against the hospital windows, the quiet of the ICU disturbed only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' feet. Julia Moore sat at her son's bedside, unwilling to let go of Ben's hand even for a moment. Every breath he took was a miracle, each tiny rise of his chest an act of defiance against the verdict that had nearly ended his life. She felt like she was perched on the edge of a cliff, every second trembling beneath her, threatening to fall away. As Ben lay still, his face serene in the pale hospital light, Julia's mind wandered back over the wreckage of the past 2 years. After the accident that had taken her husband, John, the world had become a place of silences and absences. There were the small silences, Ben not asking for his bedtime story, Dakota pacing anxiously at the door for hours, and the large ones, like the sudden emptiness at the dinner table. John had always been their anchor, and with his loss, Julia felt as if she were adrift, alone with her grief and her son's fragile health. It was on one such lonely afternoon, months after John's death, that they found Dakota. Julia had been driving back from the grocery store when she spotted a limp shape in the field just beyond their house. At first, she thought it was a coyote. Then Ben, peering from the back seat, pressed his nose to the glass and shouted, "Mom, stop! It's a dog!" Julia hesitated. She had enough troubles already. But Ben's face was pale with worry, his eyes pleading. Together they approached the battered German shepherd. He was little more than skin and bone, patches of fur missing, a gash across his shoulder. He flinched from their touch, teeth bared in panic. Ben crouched low, speaking in a soft, steady voice. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured. "We won't hurt you. I promise." Julia, watching her son, whose body so often betrayed him, pour out comfort and kindness, felt a swell of pride. They brought Dakota home, fed him in the laundry room, and slept beside him on the floor. It took days before he would eat from their hands, weeks before he stopped trembling every time someone reached out. But bit by bit, Dakota learned to trust again, drawn by Ben's stubborn gentleness. Julia often wondered if Dakota sensed, in Ben, a fellow survivor. The boy's seizures started after John's accident, terrifying, unpredictable storms that left him limp and unresponsive for hours. The doctors tried medications, new diets, whispered about possible brain damage. Through it all, Dakota never left Ben's side. At night, he'd curl around Ben's feet, head on his chest, as if guarding him from the darkness. Julia remembered the first time Dakota had predicted a seizure. She'd been making breakfast, eggs and toast, the ordinary sounds of life trying to return, when Dakota began barking, short and sharp, then whining, pressing his body against Ben, refusing to let the boy stand. Julia was frustrated. "Out of the kitchen, Dakota!" she snapped. But Ben had already collapsed, his fork clattering to the floor as his body seized. Julia barely managed to catch him before he hit the ground. The paramedics came, their faces tight with concern. "You got lucky," one said. "A minute more. It could have been much worse." Julia hugged Dakota fiercely that night, whispering her thanks, tears wetting his fur. They never trained Dakota to sense Ben's seizures. It was never a lesson taught, only a gift given, some deep, animal instinct honed by love. Over time, Dakota developed his own signals, a series of barks and growls, a persistent nudge, a refusal to let Ben out of his sight. The school nurse learned to trust Dakota's warnings. Julia's neighbors would smile, telling her, "That dog's got a sixth sense." Sometimes, Julia wondered if Dakota was part guardian angel, part wounded soul who'd found his own kind of purpose. Now, sitting beside Ben in the sterile hush of the ICU, Julia clung to those memories like lifelines. The past and present blurred together. Grief for her husband, fear for her son, gratitude for the animal who'd woven himself into the fabric of their family. She brushed Ben's hair back, her hand lingering on his forehead. "You saved him, Dakota," she whispered, glancing at the dog curled at her feet, his ears twitching at her voice. "You've always saved him." A soft knock at the door startled Julia from her thoughts. Marion entered, carrying a bag of fresh clothes and a thermos of coffee. She looked at Ben, her eyes shining with both relief and exhaustion. "Any change?" she asked quietly. Julia shook her head. "He's stable, for now. They're running more tests. They keep saying it's a miracle he's alive." Marion sank into the chair beside her, laying a hand over Julia's. "Maybe it is," she said. "Or maybe it's just love, too stubborn to let go." The two sisters sat in silence, watching Ben's chest rise and fall. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold. Dakota, sensing the change, stood and stretched, then placed his head gently on the edge of Ben's bed. His tail thumped once, twice, a slow, steady drumbeat of hope. A nurse slipped into the room, checking Ben's vitals, smiling at the sight of Dakota. "You know, I've never seen anything like this dog," she said, scratching Dakota behind the ears. "He seems to know when something's wrong before we do." Julia smiled, warmth threading through her exhaustion. "He's part of the family," she said. "He's saved Ben more times than I can count." The nurse nodded, making a note on her chart. "Sometimes the things that save us aren't the ones we expect," she said softly, before slipping back into the hallway. As the morning wore on, Julia's thoughts drifted. She remembered the nights when John was still alive. The three of them sitting on the porch, laughter mixing with the sound of cicadas. She remembered Ben's giggles as Dakota chased him through the fields, the way the dog's eyes would soften when Ben pressed his face into Dakota's fur. Those were the moments that mattered, moments carved out of ordinary days, moments that proved love could survive even the darkest storms. Hours passed in a slow, aching blur. Julia dozed in her chair, waking every few minutes to check on Ben, to make sure he was still there. Dakota never left Ben's side, only rising when a nurse entered or Julia needed to stretch her legs. When the doctors returned, Dr. Freeman leading the way, his face grave, Julia steeled herself for more bad news. "We've reviewed Ben's tests," he said, "and we believe he experienced a rare cataleptic state. It's very uncommon and difficult to diagnose. His brain activity is low, but present." Julia stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "So you were wrong," she said quietly. Freeman looked away, shame flickering across his features. "We will do everything we can," he promised. But Julia wasn't listening. Her faith was in Dakota, in the bond between a boy and his dog, in the stubborn hope that had brought them all this far. She squeezed Ben's hand, feeling the faint pulse beneath his skin, and whispered, "We're not done yet, kiddo. You hear me? We're not done." Outside, the sun rose higher, its warmth spilling through the window, casting long shadows across the hospital floor. Julia watched the light dance over Ben's face, and for the first time in days, she let herself believe, just a little, that they might make it through. With Dakota at their side, anything was possible. Hospitals at night have a way of stripping hope down to its bare bones. Julia could hear it in the echo of footsteps across the linoleum, see it in the fluorescent wash that flattened every color to pale blue and gray. There was no sun here, no comfort, only the sterile hum of machines and the quiet vigilance of those who refused to leave their loved ones' sides. She'd barely slept, but adrenaline and fear kept her upright. The entire Moore family had gathered in the cramped waiting area outside the ICU, the air heavy with anxiety and unspoken questions. Inside, Ben lay in his narrow bed, his skin ashen, fingers curled loosely around Dakota's fur. Dakota had refused to budge, all night, standing sentinel against the world. He only lifted his head when Julia's shadow flickered in the doorway. That dog, Julia thought, was the only one she trusted in this place. A nurse knocked quietly and entered, her badge reading Shaw. She checked Ben's vitals with gentle hands. "He's stable for now," she murmured. "You need rest, Mrs. Moore." Julia shook her head, her gaze never leaving her son. As dawn crept over the horizon, Julia was summoned by a brisk knock. Dr. Lance Freeman stood in the hallway, flanked by two administrators whose suits were as stiff as their expressions. He held Ben's chart like a shield. "Mrs. Moore, may I speak with you privately?" he asked. They led her to a windowless office, a space that felt more like an interrogation room than a place for healing. Julia's stomach twisted. Dr. Freeman cleared his throat, adopting the patronizing tone she'd come to dread. "Mrs. Moore, I understand this has been traumatic, but Ben's survival, while miraculous, was most likely the result of temporary neural noise, residual impulses. He's not out of danger. It's imperative we avoid unnecessary intervention or speculation." Julia felt her hands balling into fists. "You told me my son was dead. You signed his certificate. If it weren't for Dakota, Ben would be in the ground right now. Temporary neural noise doesn't cover that." Freeman's lips pressed into a thin line. The administrator beside him interjected, "We've reviewed the protocols. Everything was followed. Sometimes these cases are unclear." Unclear. The word made Julia's blood run cold. "He needs to be transferred to a pediatric neurocenter in Louisville," she said. "He needs specialists, people who know what they're doing." Freeman's eyes flickered. "That's unnecessary at this stage. We have all the resources here. Any transfer would be risky. We're keeping him under observation." Julia realized with a sick twist that Freeman was stonewalling her. He was protecting himself, not her son. She remembered the stories she'd overheard in the waiting room. Nurses whispering about bad calls, the way doctors closed ranks when mistakes were made. Suddenly, she wanted to scream. But she bit back the words, clinging to her resolve. Later, as she returned to Ben's room, Julia overheard two nurses in the hallway. "This isn't the first," one whispered. "I heard about the Thompson baby last year. Same attending physician." The other nurse glanced around nervously. "Keep your head down. No one wants trouble." Julia's anger curdled into something darker, rage fueled by fear. If Freeman had made mistakes before, how many other children had suffered? She needed proof. She needed someone to listen. Dakota pressed his head into her hand as she sat by Ben's side, grounding her, reminding her of what mattered. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found a number she hadn't called in years, Ellen DeWitt, a local reporter known for stirring up trouble at City Hall. Julia hesitated for just a moment, then sent a single text. "Something's wrong at County General. My son was declared dead, and he's alive. Dr. Lance Freeman, I need help." Within minutes, Ellen responded, "Call me ASAP." Julia stepped into the empty stairwell, her hands trembling as she recounted Ben's story. Dakota's alert, the hospital's resistance. Ellen listened, her questions sharp and focused. "You're sure Freeman was the attending?" she asked. "Any documentation?" He signed the death certificate. He tried to keep Ben from being transferred, and now he's stalling, saying Ben's recovery is just noise. "I think he's covering something up." Ellen's tone hardened. "I'll start digging. But you should be careful. Hospitals close ranks when there's liability. Document everything. Don't trust anyone with your son's chart except the nurses you know by name." Julia thanked her, heart pounding. She returned to Ben's room, watching as Dakota shifted, alert again. It struck her. Dakota had never cared about bureaucracy or politics. He only responded to what was real, to the changes in Ben's body and the truth in Julia's voice. Hours passed, in a blur of tests and consultations. Every time Julia demanded answers, Freeman grew colder, more evasive. She caught him in Ben's electronic chart, typing quickly, then deleting entries. Julia snapped a photo of the screen on her phone when he wasn't looking. Later, Nurse Shaw confirmed her fears in a whisper. He's changed Ben's record twice since you arrived. He's hiding something, Julia. The tension in the hospital grew. Julia could feel eyes on her. Staff who avoided her gaze. Others who offered furtive support. At one point, a security guard hovered by Ben's door, asking to see her ID badge. Just protocol, ma'am, he said, but Julia saw the doubt in his eyes. That evening, as darkness crept back into the corners of the ward, Julia sat beside Ben, her mind racing. Dakota was curled up at Ben's side, breathing slow and steady, one paw draped protectively across the boy's legs. Julia whispered, "Don't let go, buddy. I need you to watch him while I fight." She pulled out her phone and wrote up everything, dates, times, conversations, photos. She emailed the file to Ellen, to Marion, and to herself. "If anything happens to me or Ben," she wrote, "don't let this go." Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was Ellen. Sources confirmed 2 prior malpractice suits against Freeman, both settled quietly. "We'll try to get more." Julia stared at the message, anger boiling in her veins. How many families had been silenced? How many had lost children to mistakes buried under paperwork and jargon? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a hospital administrator. This one, a woman with cold eyes, invited Julia to a private meeting. She spoke in calm, measured tones about parental stress and emotional instability. Julia realized, horrified, that they were threatening her custody of Ben if she went public. "We only want what's best for your son," the woman said, the edge of warning unmistakable. Julia stood, every muscle trembling with fury and fear. "What's best for my son is honesty. And right now, I don't trust any of you." She stepped outside, into the biting rain, barely feeling the cold. Dakota followed, pressing his wet nose to her thigh. "They think I'll stop," Julia whispered, a grim smile curling her lips. "They don't know who raised me." She looked back at the hospital, at the shadowy windows where her son fought for his life. As she stood there, another mother approached, a stranger whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I heard what happened," she whispered. "My daughter died here 2 years ago. They said it was neurological uncertainty. I always thought there was more." Julia nodded, hope and resolve blooming inside her. "We'll find out the truth. For Ben. For all of them." She turned, Dakota at her side, ready for the battle ahead. The storm was only beginning, but Julia had found her weapon. Truth, sharpened by a mother's fury and a dog's unfailing loyalty. Night in the pediatric ICU always felt like a long exhale, a slow surrender of energy and light. The corridors grew quieter, nurses moving like ghosts past closed doors, their shoes barely whispering on the tile. Outside Ben's room, rain tapped against the windows in an uneven rhythm. Inside, it was Dakota's gentle breathing that kept Julia anchored. Ben's room was still, except for the blinking lights on the monitors and the dog stretched out along the length of Ben's bed. Dakota seemed impossibly alert for a creature who had hardly slept. He'd refused to leave, had fought, growling, barking, his whole body tense, when an orderly tried to take him out for hygiene reasons. Nurse Shaw had intervened, arguing that the dog had a medical purpose now, whether anyone understood it or not. The hospital night shift brought a different energy. The staff was leaner, less formal, and some were starting to whisper about Ben's story, the boy who'd come back from death, the German shepherd who'd refused to let go. Julia sat by Ben, her head bowed, half praying, half planning her next move. She had documents sent to the reporter, photos of the chart changes, whispers from other parents saved on her phone. But tonight, all that could wait. Ben's hand twitched under her fingers, and Julia squeezed it, whispering, "I'm here, honey. I'm right here." Dakota suddenly tensed, his head snapping up. Julia watched as he stared at Ben, his ears pricking, his body rigid. He let out a low, urgent whine, and then began that pattern again. Short bark, long pause, then the sequence she knew by heart. Julia's heart skipped. Instinct took over. She pressed the call button. "Ben's vitals," Julia called as 2 nurses rushed in. The dog's alerting again. One nurse, a young woman named Faith, glanced at the monitors. Heart rate's up, fast. Respiration irregular. She looked at Dakota, disbelief warring with professional training. I've never seen a dog do that. Julia held Ben's hand, trying not to show how frightened she was. Dakota's pattern intensified. The monitors began to beep, lines on the screen jagged. Faith barked out orders, grabbing for oxygen, her voice rising. Get Dr. Sosa? We might be losing him. The seconds stretched into eternity. Dakota let out a single, piercing bark and then went utterly still, his eyes locked on Ben. Faith placed a trembling hand on Julia's shoulder, but before she could say more, the monitor's tone changed, stabilizing. Ben's vitals for the first time in hours returned to normal parameters. The room felt charged with an energy beyond science. Faith slumped against the wall, tears bright in her eyes. He called it. The dog called it. Julia nodded, emotion choking her. He always does. He's not just a comfort animal. He's Ben's partner. Another nurse, older and skeptical, entered and saw the aftermath. Dakota still at attention, Ben's stats now normal. She shook her head, but Faith stepped in. You should have seen it. The dog knew before the machines did. Julia wiped her eyes, determination growing stronger. He's more than a therapy dog. There's something about him and Ben. It's like they're tuned to each other. News of the incident spread through the night staff, and by morning it was the talk of the unit. Julia overheard the nurses at shift change. They should be studying that dog, one said. I mean, how is this possible? Later that day, the hospital director appeared at Ben's door with a vet neurologist in tow. A woman named Dr. Susan Geller, petite and sharp-eyed, with hands that moved gently even when she was all business. I'm here to observe Dakota, she said, kneeling in front of the dog, letting him sniff her hand. I've seen therapy dogs. But if what the nurses are saying is true, well, that's not training. That's something else. Julia explained Dakota's history, how they'd found him, the seizures, the untrained alerts. Dr. Geller listened intently, jotting notes. When did you first notice he could predict the episodes? Julia recounted the story of that first breakfast. The stubborn dog, blocking Ben from standing just minutes before his collapse. It's always been about Ben, she finished. He just knows. Dr. Geller nodded. There's growing research into scent detection. Dogs can smell minute changes in human chemistry, even at the neurological level. But the way you described Dakota's response, it's almost like he's reading Ben's mind. She asked if she could set up a video camera and special EEG. Julia agreed, desperate for any answers. That night, Dakota curled up beside Ben as Dr. Geller and the nurses monitored everything. Hours crawled by. At 2 a.m., Dakota stirred, lifted his head, and whined softly. Julia held her breath. A minute later, Ben's EEG flickered, tiny anomalies appearing, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Dr. Geller sat up, startled. That's an onset. He knew before the machines did. The hospital's skepticism began to fade. Nurses started stopping by Ben's room on breaks, some just to see Dakota in action. He's a legend already, one whispered, snapping a picture for her daughter. But there was tension too. Julia caught two doctors arguing outside the door, one worried that this kind of publicity could make us look foolish if it's all anecdote. The other just shrugged. He saved that kid. I'll take a dog's bark over a missed diagnosis any day. Julia found herself growing braver. When Freeman walked in the next morning demanding to see Ben's charts, Julia stood her ground. Dakota's staying. And you're not touching Ben without me or Dr. Geller present. Freeman glared, frustration twisting his features, but said nothing. Julia could see cracks forming in his confidence. His voice was quieter, his hands less steady. That evening, after a long day of tests and questions, Julia found a note, slid under Ben's door. It was from Nurse Shaw. Some of us believe you, watch your back. There are records being kept off the system. The support gave Julia a flicker of hope. She checked on Ben, now sleeping peacefully with Dakota's head across his legs. She brushed her son's cheek, then looked Dakota in the eyes. "You're not just a dog. You're a miracle," she whispered. As night fell again, Julia sat at the window, watching rain streak the glass. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a quiet smile. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. Ben was alive. Dakota was watching, and somewhere in the darkness, the truth was waiting to be found. She would not give up. Not now, not ever. By sunrise, Ben's hospital room was no longer just a place for hope and worry. It had become a kind of secret headquarters. Julia sat with her back against the window, her phone buzzing with texts from Ellen the reporter, Nurse Shaw, and even parents she'd never met. The story was spreading. Someone at the local TV station had picked it up, and Julia's phone filled with messages from strangers, some offering prayers, some sharing stories of their own losses. Julia's exhaustion felt bone deep, but adrenaline and stubborn resolve kept her moving. Dakota had finally slept, curled into a tight ball at Ben's feet, only stirring when someone approached the bed. Ben's vitals had stabilized, though he still hadn't woken. Julia watched her son's chest rise and fall, counting each breath as a quiet victory. She tried not to think about all that could go wrong. That morning, a local news van parked out front, drawing curious glances from hospital staff. By noon, Julia's story, "Dog Saves Boy from Premature Burial," was the lead on every screen in the family lounge. Nurse Shaw caught Julia in the hallway and slipped her an envelope, eyes darting around. "Don't open it here," she whispered, "but you need to see this, and be careful." Julia's fingers trembled as she stuffed the envelope into her purse. When she finally found a private moment in the deserted stairwell, she tore it open. Inside were printed copies of internal incident reports. She recognized the hospital's letterhead, and as she read, her heart pounded faster. One report described a 3-year-old girl, case closed as neurological uncertainty, attended by Dr. Freeman. Another, a baby boy. Again, Freeman, again. No hope of recovery. Again. Parents who had quietly disappeared. Each report was marked confidential. It was all there, black and white. Dr. Freeman had misdiagnosed at least 2 pediatric deaths, both swept under medical jargon and administrative coldness. Julia's breath caught as she realized the full scale of what she was holding. It wasn't just about Ben. How many other parents had been told to let go? How many had believed it, trusted the system, and buried their children without knowing there could have been another outcome? She wanted to scream. Instead, she steadied herself and returned to Ben's room, tucking the envelope away. She called Ellen and told her everything. "They'll come after you," Ellen warned. "This is bigger than just malpractice. It's liability, reputation. They'll do anything to make you look unstable, unfit, emotional, anything to silence you." Julia's resolve only hardened. "I'm not backing down. I can't." An hour later, Julia was summoned to a meeting in the hospital's legal office. The space was cold and quiet, walls covered in framed diplomas. The hospital's lead counsel, a man named Harold Dent, met her with a tight, polite smile. "We're concerned about your recent activities, Mrs. Moore. The hospital's reputation is at stake. You've been very vocal with the press, and some of our staff feel threatened." Julia stared at him, heart pounding. "You're threatening me because I want the truth?" Dent didn't blink. "We're simply concerned that your emotional state may not be in Ben's best interest. If this continues, we may need to reevaluate your parental authority and Ben's care plan." Julia's hands shook, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Is that a threat? Are you telling me if I keep asking questions, you'll take my son away?" Dent's voice softened, the threat only more menacing for it. "We hope it won't come to that. But you must understand, the media attention is disruptive to patient care." Julia left the office shaking with rage and fear. Outside, the sky had turned steel gray. She stood in the rain for a long minute, the cold biting her cheeks. Dakota pressed against her legs. "They think I'll stop," she whispered to him, her voice low and fierce. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." As Julia re-entered the hospital, She found a group of parents clustered by the coffee machine. One recognized her from the news. "Are you the Moore mom?" she asked softly. "My son died here last year, diagnosed with complications of seizure disorder." I never believed it. Another parent stepped forward, voice shaking. "My daughter, too, Dr. Freeman. I've always wondered." Julia listened to them, seeing in their faces the same grief, the same confusion and doubt that had haunted her. "There's a pattern," she said quietly. "And it's not just Ben." The group exchanged stories, timelines, and hospital room numbers. Julia took notes on her phone, feeling an underground network of truth beginning to emerge. Inside Ben's room, Nurse Shaw visited, looking more tense than ever. "The hospital's watching you. I had to sneak those files out. I could lose my job, but someone has to do the right thing." Julia squeezed her hand, gratitude flooding through her. "You're saving lives," Julia said. "You know that, right?" As the hours passed, the stress grew heavier. Julia checked her emails. No word from the public interest lawyer she'd reached out to, but she knew she couldn't wait. She walked to the nurse's station and requested an official transfer for Ben to the Neuro Center in Louisville, citing medical neglect and a conflict of interest. Freeman tried to intercept, telling the staff Ben was too unstable for transfer. But Julia had documented everything. She sent the request by email and then, at Ellen's advice, copied the Kentucky Board of Medicine, attaching the incident reports and a timeline of Ben's misdiagnosis. The atmosphere in the hospital changed overnight. Staff whispered as Julia walked past. Some offered encouraging smiles, others glared. 2 security guards stationed themselves by the ICU entrance. Julia knew she was being watched, but it only made her more determined. That night, Dakota pressed himself close to Julia as she sat in the dark, eyes red and swollen. "We have to fight, buddy," she whispered, running her fingers through his thick fur. "For Ben, for those other kids, for everyone who never got the truth." A notification pinged on her phone, an email from a lawyer named Aisha Grant. "I'd like to represent you. Don't let them intimidate you. I'll meet you tomorrow." Julia let herself exhale, a tremor of hope flickering inside her. Outside, thunder rumbled. She looked at Ben, still unconscious but peaceful. She watched Dakota curl himself around the boy, a silent promise that he would protect him, always. As midnight approached, Julia scrolled through her messages from other parents, reading their stories, sharing their anger, and their hope. She realized this was bigger than just Ben. It was about justice, about refusing to let power and protocol silence the truth. With Dakota by her side, with the community gathering behind her, Julia felt the scales tipping, just a little, toward what was right. She brushed Ben's hair back, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "We're not alone anymore. We're going to win this. I promise." Dakota thumped his tail, eyes shining with that ancient, steadfast loyalty. Outside, the storm broke, rain lashing against the glass as if the world itself was bearing witness. Julia closed her eyes, holding on to hope, holding on to the fight, and knowing the reckoning was finally coming. The pediatric rehab center was never truly quiet, but that early morning felt different, tense, expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Outside, the sun barely peeked through streaks of rain, painting the parking lot in silver and gold. Julia sat by Ben's bedside, the sleepless exhaustion of the past week pressing down on her shoulders. Every hour, she brushed her son's hair, held his hand, whispered stories about home and Dakota's latest antics. Ben hadn't responded, but he was alive, and she'd promised him she wouldn't stop fighting. Dakota never left Ben's side. The dog had settled into a routine, pacing circles around the bed, then curling tightly at Ben's feet, ever watchful. His fur was flecked with gray, his eyes bloodshot from lack of rest, but he remained vigilant, as if the fate of his boy depended on his refusal to sleep. The nurses rotated in and out, some offering coffee and warm words. Others, still wary of the press circus outside, avoided Julia's gaze. A few, though, lingered longer by Ben's bedside, their eyes softening whenever Dakota gently rested his muzzle on Ben's arm. "You're famous now, buddy," Julia murmured, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You and Ben, you've started something big." Suddenly, Dakota's body tensed. He rose, ears pricking, nose quivering as if he'd caught a scent no human could detect. In a slow, deliberate motion, he placed his paw on Ben's arm and nudged it gently. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, Ben's fingers twitched. Julia's heart leapt. She leaned in, her breath caught in her throat. Dakota nudged Ben's arm again, a quiet whine rumbling in his chest. Ben's hand moved. A little more this time, his fingers curling, weak but determined, around Dakota's paw. A stunned hush filled the room. Julia's hands flew to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes as hope threatened to overwhelm her. She pressed the call button, voice trembling. "He moved! Ben just moved!" Within seconds, the room was full. Nurses, therapists, 2 residents who'd been following Ben's case, all crowding the doorway. Someone paged the pediatrician. Dakota sat perfectly still, his gaze locked on Ben, not daring to move as the monitors began to show subtle spikes. Faint at first, then building in intensity. Ben's eyelids fluttered. He groaned, a soft, disoriented sound, and then, slowly, his eyes opened, blinking against the harsh light. His gaze was unfocused, lost for a moment in a world between dreams and waking. Then he saw Dakota, saw his mom's face, and a single word slipped out. Hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Mom." Julia's knees buckled. She crashed into the side of the bed, clutching Ben's hand as relief and joy poured out in sobs. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. You're safe." The room erupted in activity. Nurses checked vitals. A pediatric neurologist peppered Julia with questions about Ben's movements, cognitive responses, memory. Dakota, sensing the moment's intensity, lay his head on Ben's chest, tail wagging softly. News spread fast. Ben Moore had woken up. Outside, a small crowd of reporters jostled for a quote. Parents in the special needs community texted Julia congratulations, and within the hospital, a hush of awe replaced the earlier tension. Some staff called it a miracle, others, the result of Dakota's relentless vigilance. Not everyone was convinced. Dr. Leland Frost, a new neuroconsultant brought in after the hospital board's mounting pressure, swept into the room that afternoon with a crisp white coat, icy blue eyes, and the air of a man determined to take charge. He looked over Ben's chart, barely glancing at Julia. "Reflexes, that's all," he declared. "Spontaneous movement is not the same as recovery. Let's be scientific." Julia bristled. "He spoke to me. He recognized Dakota." Frost arched an eyebrow. "You're exhausted, Mrs. Moore. The mind can play tricks under stress. We'll run a new series of tests." He snapped orders at the nurses, then eyed Dakota. "Remove the animal from the medical wing. There's no justification for a pet in a sterile environment." The words sent a jolt of panic through Julia. She stood her ground. "He stays. You saw what happened. Dakota's the only reason my son is alive." Frost's face tightened. "I won't repeat myself. Security will escort the dog out." Before Julia could argue, alarms blared. Ben's heart monitor spiked, dangerously high, then plummeted. Dakota, ignoring the adults, leapt onto the bed, pawing urgently at Ben's chest, letting out a deep, rumbling bark. Nurses rushed in, pushing Frost aside. "He's going into an episode," one shouted. "Get the oxygen. Stat!" Dakota's alert had come seconds before the monitors, and his intervention brought the medical team running before Frost could act. The staff worked in concert, stabilizing Ben, the room alive with focused urgency. After what felt like an eternity, Ben's breathing evened out, his color slowly returning. The tension broke as the head nurse, Lydia Shaw, stepped in, tears in her eyes. She crossed the room and placed Dakota's paw gently on Ben's chest, whispering, "We listen now." Around her, the other nurses nodded, some openly crying. Frost watched in disbelief, his authority unraveling in the face of the bond between boy and dog. Later, as Julia sat with Ben, exhausted but buoyed by hope, Nurse Shaw leaned in and whispered, "We should have listened sooner. There's something about Dakota and Ben, something no test can measure." It was in that quiet moment Julia learned the truth she'd only suspected. Lydia glanced around, then confided, They tried to suppress an earlier EEG result, a reading that suggested Ben was never brain dead. They were afraid of the liability. We only saw it now because you made noise. Julia's fury was tempered by the simple joy of seeing Ben awake. Dakota pressed close, refusing to let the world break their connection. The fight wasn't over. The hospital would still try to save face, but the tide was turning. The staff was no longer united in silence. Some, like Shaw, were willing to risk their jobs for the truth. As evening fell, Julia held Ben's hand, watching as Dakota dozed, one ear cocked for trouble. For the first time, the future felt possible again. A fragile hope, but real. She thought of all the parents who'd lost their children and never had answers. She thought of the power of instinct, of love that refused to be ignored, and of a dog who had become more than a pet. Dakota had become Ben's lifeline. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating the small family, boy, mother, dog, each survivor in their own way. Julia squeezed Ben's hand and whispered, "We're not alone anymore. We're going to make sure everyone knows what you and Dakota have done." In the hallway, Julia heard whispers, staff and patients alike. The silence was gone, replaced by something stronger, faith. In this time, it was rooted in the unbreakable bond between a mother, her son, and a dog whose instincts had saved a life. If you walked into the hearing room that day, you might have felt it. The weight of too many stories and too much silence pressing against the wood-paneled walls. Julia Moore sat near the front, hands folded in her lap, Dakota at her feet. He wore a new collar for the occasion, his fur brushed, but his eyes never left Ben, who sat in a wheelchair close by. All around them, people whispered, news cameras blinked red, and the heavy shuffle of officials settling into their seats echoed like distant thunder. This was the day they'd waited for. The State Medical Board hearing. The prosecutor's voice rang out, clear and precise. Today, we hear testimony regarding Dr. Lance Freeman and County General Hospital's handling of pediatric cases. We will address allegations of malpractice, cover-ups, and institutional neglect. Julia could feel every eye on her, but she refused to flinch. This wasn't just about Ben. It was for the parents who'd found her in hospital halls, who had sent emails late at night, whispering their fears about Freeman and the cold machinery of bureaucracy. Some were in the audience, their faces pale with hope and dread. Others clutched tissue, photos of lost children folded in their hands. The first to speak was a mother named Anna Turner, her voice trembling as she described the loss of her son 2 years earlier. Same doctor, same diagnosis, same empty answers. "I trusted them," Anna whispered, "but no one ever explained why my boy stopped breathing." Next was Marcus Reed, whose daughter had been sent home with complications of neurological disorder and never woke up. The room fell silent with each new story, patterns too alike to be coincidence. Then it was Julia's turn. She rose, steady but shaking, feeling Dakota's presence like a living anchor at her side. "I was told my son was dead. I was told to plan his funeral, to let him go. But a dog, Dakota, knew better. He wouldn't stop barking, wouldn't let me give up. That's why my son is alive. But this wasn't luck. This was a mistake that could have killed him. It could have killed others. And it did." She took a breath, her voice ringing stronger. "Dr. Freeman altered my son's chart to cover his error. When I demanded a transfer, I was threatened with losing my parental rights. The hospital's legal team tried to silence me, told me I was unstable. But the only instability was in a system more afraid of lawsuits than children's lives." As Julia spoke, she presented emails and internal reports, copies of the confidential files Nurse Shaw had risked her job to deliver. The evidence laid out timelines, missed warnings, falsified notes, and 2 more pediatric deaths swept under neurological uncertainty. The board members whispered urgently. Even the most stoic faces in the crowd began to crack. Next, the nurses stepped forward, Lydia Shaw and Faith among them. They recounted Dakota's alerts, the cover-up of the EEG anomaly, the refusal to allow a transfer. Lydia's voice was firm. "If it weren't for that dog, and this mother's persistence, Ben Moore would be another statistic. When it was Dr. Freeman's turn, he looked exhausted, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. His lawyer prompted him, but his voice was hoarse. "You think I wanted to hurt kids?" He shot back, emotion fraying his calm. "You think I enjoyed telling parents there was no hope? The system doesn't give us time or the tools. The hospital's underfunded, we're overworked, and if you make one mistake, just one, it follows you forever. You don't know what it's like? The pressure—" He broke off, running a hand through thinning hair. For a second, the room was silent except for the soft, steady breathing of Dakota, who seemed to understand the tension. A board member leaned forward. "Dr. Freeman, this isn't about one mistake. It's about a pattern. It's about children who didn't have to die." Freeman sagged, defeat in his posture. "We failed. Not just me, the whole institution, but I should have listened. I should have trusted what I saw, not just what the charts said. I'm sorry." That apology, thin and broken, hung in the air. The silence was shattered by the head of the board. "This panel finds that Dr. Freeman's actions constituted gross negligence and willful misrepresentation. His medical license is hereby revoked, effective immediately." There was a stunned hush, no applause, only the rustle of papers and a few stifled sobs. But it didn't end there. Julia watched as the board presented the evidence of emails and falsified lab reports to the hospital's CEO, who had been called to testify. He tried to deflect blame, citing underfunding and extraordinary pressures. But the pattern was clear: corners cut, protocols ignored, silence bought with threats and legal warnings. As the hearing concluded, the CEO announced his resignation, his words empty and formal. He exited, leaving behind a legacy now stained by neglect and grief. The board pledged to launch a full-scale review of pediatric procedures, to open investigations into other hospitals statewide. The press swarmed as Julia wheeled Ben out of the hearing room, Dakota at their side. Reporters fired questions. "How does it feel to win? What will you do now?" But Julia could only think of the families whose children hadn't been saved, whose stories were lost in the cracks. She spoke quietly into a cluster of microphones. "This isn't about victory. It's about truth. About making sure no family goes through what we did." That night, Julia sat with Ben and Dakota in the hotel room, exhaustion mingling with a strange, hollow relief. Ben was tired but awake, his mind still fuzzy from days in the hospital, but he smiled as Dakota nudged his hand. "Is it over, Mom?" he asked. Julia kissed his forehead. "The worst part, maybe? But we have more to do. We have to help the other kids, too." Ben nodded, his eyes serious. "Dakota can help them. He's magic." Julia smiled, holding her son close, Dakota's tail thumping quietly against the floor. She looked out at the city lights, feeling hope in the burden of responsibility. She knew the battle was far from over, but at least now, the truth was no longer buried. Across the city, phones rang in newsrooms and lawyers' offices. Parents who had lost hope began to reach out again, emboldened by Julia's fight. The system had been shaken, and while there was much work left, a path forward was finally visible. In that quiet moment, as the world moved on, Julia closed her eyes, whispering thanks for the courage she'd found in the darkest hours, for Ben's heartbeat, for Dakota's bark, for the community that refused to be silenced. A year had passed since that thunderous hearing, yet Julia still found herself waking some nights to the ghostly echo of Dakota's desperate barks, the memory of cold casket wood, and Ben's impossibly faint heartbeat. But time, as it does, had given new shape to the pain. Now there was a future, one defined not by fear, but by hope, and responsibility to those who still lived in the shadows of silence. It was the opening morning of the National Veterinary Medical Symposium. The air in the downtown convention hall was electric, filled with scientists, doctors, and animal lovers from across the country. Julia stood backstage, gripping the edge of a folded speech with damp palms. She wore a simple navy dress. Ben was by her side in a wheelchair, fiddling nervously with the buttons on his shirt, while Dakota, older but still proud, rested his great head on Ben's lap. Julia had been invited to deliver the keynote, an honor she'd never imagined in her old life. Before loss and a dog's devotion had rewritten her story, she watched the audience fill in, men in crisp suits, women in white coats, a few families with children and service dogs pressed close. There was a sense of anticipation. Whispers about the boy who'd returned from the dead, the dog who had defied medicine, the mother who wouldn't be quiet. A hush fell as Julia wheeled Ben out to the podium. She paused, scanning the sea of faces. Dakota followed, tail sweeping the floor, pausing only when Ben stopped beside her. For a moment, Julia felt small in the spotlight, but then she looked at Ben, felt Dakota's calm presence, and found her voice. "My name is Julia Moore. Last year, I stood in a church, planning my son's funeral. The doctors said he was gone. But Dakota, our rescue German shepherd, thought otherwise. He wouldn't let us say goodbye. That instinct, that bond, saved my child's life. And it taught me more about medicine than a decade of working in an ER ever did." She spoke of those first harrowing days, Ben's collapse, Dakota's urgent bark, the impossibility of hope. She recounted how the hospital's machines had failed to read what a dog's heart could sense, how bureaucracy and fear of blame nearly ended her son's story before it began. Then she paused, her voice trembling, the room utterly silent. Dakota never read a chart. He never saw a scan. He didn't even know what a seizure was. But he knew Ben. He loved Ben. That love made him alert us every time, sometimes minutes before the machines ever noticed. We called it instinct, but maybe it's more. Maybe it's the oldest science, the science of connection. The audience leaned in as Julia described the moment Dakota limped to Ben's crib. Ben just 2 years old, feverish and listless. Dakota had pressed his nose to Ben's cheek, whimpered, then barked and barked until Julia ran in. She'd found Ben seizing, saved by a dog's refusal to ignore what love told him was wrong. "Every doctor in that hospital missed it," she said, but Dakota didn't. As she spoke, Julia saw faces change. Some listeners wiped their eyes, others scribbled furious notes. She ended with a challenge and a hope. What machines miss, love sometimes finds. The pulse of life doesn't always come through wires. It comes through connection. I'm not saying ignore technology or science or protocols. I'm saying don't ignore what's right in front of you. Don't ignore the family, the instincts, the possibility that science hasn't explained everything yet. Dakota is proof. Ben is proof. Please, listen, even when you think you know better. There was a long, breathless pause. Then the room erupted in applause, not polite, but roaring and genuine. Ben grinned, pride bright in his eyes, while Dakota sat up, tail wagging, as if he understood the ovation was for him. Afterward, as Julia accepted hugs and handshakes, a small crowd gathered. Doctors asked for more details about Dakota's alerts. Researchers inquired about blood samples, EEG readings, the timing of Dakota's warnings. But the conversation soon shifted from data to something deeper. Stories of other animals, of family members who'd known somehow when something was wrong. A surgeon from Maryland recounted his own therapy dog barking outside the OR door just before a patient crashed. A young mother described her autistic son's cat refusing to leave his side during a fever that nearly took his life. Julia realized how many people needed permission to trust what couldn't be measured. The afternoon brought the event's highest honor. Dakota was recognized by the National Health Institute as the first untrained seizure alert dog to receive official commendation. Julia stood beside him as he accepted the medal, the crowd on their feet. Ben beamed with pride. "He's a real hero now, Mom," he whispered, hugging Dakota's neck. A panel discussion followed, focused on the future of medicine, instinct, and technology together. Julia sat among experts, answering questions about balancing modern diagnostics with patient intuition. She repeated her core belief: no machine can replace what it means to really know someone. Sometimes, the best diagnostic tool is love and the willingness to listen. That evening, at the gala dinner, Julia sat by a window with Ben and Dakota, watching city lights flicker. She felt the exhaustion of the last year in her bones, but also a growing peace. There was no simple ending. Ben still faced challenges. Dakota was older now. The scars from the hospital fight hadn't faded. But they were together. Their story, once nearly cut short, had grown beyond themselves. In a quiet moment, Ben asked, "Mom, are you glad you listened to Dakota, even when everyone said you were wrong?" Julia smiled, her heart full. "I'll never regret it. Sometimes you have to trust what you feel, even when the world doesn't believe you. And sometimes what saves you isn't a doctor or a machine, but a dog who loves you too much to let go." They sat together, Dakota lying quietly at Ben's feet, survivors all. Julia looked at the boy, the dog, the world outside, and thought of the lesson she wanted to leave behind. Science mattered, medicine mattered, but above all, humanity mattered most. "What machines miss, love sometimes finds," she whispered. And in the warmth of that small family, boy, mother, and dog, the world seemed, for a moment, full of possibility. The first snow of the season drifted silently across Green Hollow Park, painting every bare branch and fence post in shimmering white. It was the kind of Kentucky winter morning that made the world feel new and old all at once. A gentle hush, punctuated only by the laughter of children bundled in bright coats, the crunch of boots on ice, and the crisp, joyful barks of Dakota, now sporting a bright red scarf. It had been a year since the hearing, a year since Julia had stood in that hospital room terrified that hope would never come. Today, hope was everywhere. Ben, walking shakily but unaided for the first time since his illness, clutched a battered tennis ball in one hand. Each step was careful, determined, but his smile was wide and unguarded. With every awkward lurch, Dakota circled back, touching his nose to Ben's knee as if to remind him, "I'm here. I won't let you fall." Julia watched, tears pricking her eyes, as Ben drew back his arm and threw the ball with all his might. It spun in a wild arc, vanishing into a flurry of snow. Dakota bounded after it, his movements a little slower than before but full of purpose and joy. The park echoed with cheers as other children gathered to watch, some in wheelchairs, some with braces or canes, kids who had come to Green Hollow for a new reason. The Ben and Dakota Fund had become real, matching rescue dogs with children facing neurological conditions, and today's event was the first of many. Uncle Ray stood beside Julia, hands thrust deep in his pockets, pride etched in every line of his weathered face. "You know, Jules," he said, his voice thick, "I never thought I'd see the day. That boy, he's tougher than nails." Julia nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. She remembered all the long nights, fighting hospital bureaucracy, reading every article she could find on animal instinct, sitting in Ben's room with Dakota's warm weight against her legs. She thought of every family who'd reached out after the news story, every parent who sent a photograph or a letter. So many had found hope in their darkest moments, drawn by a story that began with a single desperate bark. A little girl wheeled up next to Ben, her mittens clumsy on her lap. She watched as Dakota returned, ball in mouth, his breath clouding in the cold. "Can dogs really do that?" she asked, eyes wide and hopeful. Ben grinned, shy but proud. "They can if you believe in them. Dakota saved my life. Now he's helping other kids too." The girl's mother looked at Julia, her face etched with worry and something softer, maybe faith. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up." Julia knelt, brushing snow from Ben's hair. Sometimes all it takes is someone who refuses to stop listening, not just to the doctors or the machines, but to the ones who know us best. The morning became a celebration. Volunteers distributed hot cocoa, families swapped stories, and dogs chased balls and laughter through the snow. There were speeches and local reporters, but Julia was most proud when she watched Dakota approach each child with the same calm, careful energy he'd shown Ben, sensing who needed a nuzzle, who needed a bark, who needed to be watched just a little more closely. As the sun rose higher, Julia found herself standing beside the simple plaque unveiled beneath the old oak tree. The Ben and Dakota Fund. in honor of unlikely heroes. Below the words were two sets of footprints, one small, one paw-shaped, cast in brass and set in a heart. Later, as the park emptied, Julia sat on a bench. Ben curled beside her, Dakota's great head resting on her lap. Uncle Ray and Marion joined them, and for a long while, they said nothing at all. Just listened to the gentle hush of snow and the far-off shouts of children playing. Julia thought about everything they had survived. She remembered the despair, the anger, the stubborn refusal to let anyone else decide what was possible. She remembered the faces of the families who'd lost children, some now friends, some still too raw to speak. She knew the fight wasn't over. There were more hospitals, more stories, more battles ahead. But for today, they had won. For today, the world had changed, even if just a little. Dakota shifted, pressing closer to Ben. His body curled protectively around the boy who had once saved him. Ben pressed his hand into the thick fur and closed his eyes, breathing slow, steady, safe. A reporter approached, notepad ready, but Julia shook her head gently. "No interviews right now," she said, her voice kind but firm. "This is our moment. Let's let it be." As the afternoon sun set, painting the park in gold and pink, Julia looked down and saw Dakota's tracks circling bends in the snow. The shape was unmistakable, a rough, uneven heart, drawn by two survivors who'd found each other in the world's darkest moment. The families began to pack up, some pausing to take photos, others promising to return. The little girl in the wheelchair called out, "Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dakota," as her mother pushed her away. Julia hugged her son tightly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you. Not because you survived, but because you never stopped believing. Believing in love, in loyalty, in the things we can't always explain." She glanced down at Dakota, who wagged his tail and thumped it against the bench. "You too, old friend," she said, smiling. "You showed us that faith doesn't always wear a white coat. Sometimes it has fur and four paws." The wind picked up, swirling the last of the snowflakes around them. Julia stood, brushing the snow from her coat, and took Ben's hand in hers. Together, they walked home. Boy, mother, and dog, leaving behind a trail of heart-shaped tracks in the white. The lesson was simple, but it echoed in Julia's heart and would live on in every family touched by their story. You don't need a stethoscope to hear the truth, just someone who refuses to stop listening. She turned, waving to the last of the volunteers. If this story touched your heart, share it, remember it, and let it be a reminder. Sometimes, faith is four paws and a heartbeat. And as the lights faded in Green Hollow Park, Ben and Dakota lay in the snow side by side, quiet, together, survivors, healers, proof that hope, once unleashed, can change everything.